And a report on the projects that the Bhaktivedanta Institute in Princeton is working on. Aristotle proposed that the absolute truth, or theos, in its highest form, was thought, thinking thought, in Greek called noesis, noesios, noesis. He considered thought, or the act of thinking, to be what is actual, with emphasis on the word act. Actuality is active, and pure activity is thinking. The absolute, or truth, is pure thinking, pure actuality without any remainder or potentiality. It should be noted that absolute thinking is quite distinct from the modern viewpoint of finite subjective thinking. At the same time, Aristotle did not have a conception of personality associated with thinking, as was later understood by Hegel, under the category of absolute being for self beyond mere being in itself. What does not think, Aristotle considered potentiality, in Greek dynamis, which is matter or the potential for being actualized or thought. In other words, matter was the potentiality of thought or actuality. Thus, for the ancients, thought and being were not considered a dualism, as the modern Cartesian philosophy presents, which Descartes called res cogitans and res extensa. Here we have a representation of thinking substance, cognition, versus extended substance, or matter. These opposing substances were, however, united in a third, God. Many major philosophical changes came about since the ancients. Two that will be focused on here are, 1, thinking or cognition was now considered as substance instead of activity, and 2, an opposition was made between thinking or cognitive substance and matter as extended substance. Leaving out God, what is left is the conception that thinking, cognition, and extended matter, or local, spatial, material bodies, are opposed to one another in an independent manner. This, in brief, is how modern scientific philosophy came to consider things. We find a similar dualistic philosophy represented in Sankhya, in which Prakriti, or matter, is distinguished from Purusha, or the non-material person. This dualistic conception makes it difficult or impossible for the modern mindset to understand how thought, or mind, and matter can interact. So difficult that modern science has neglected to answer that question and simply presumed it is only about matter that we are to be concerned. The modern scientific attitude is that somehow the problem of thought will be handled once the idea is reduced to the activity of matter, electricity, or the combination of neurons and their patterns in the brain. When Srila Prabhupada asked the scientists in the early 70s to explain and prove that life comes from life and that matter comes from life using scientific knowledge, it became problematic because of the dualistic nature of the philosophy that science has adopted. The role of cognition, the scientist, in science is completely neglected. However, since that time, science itself has advanced to the point where it has faced one crisis after another in maintaining its dualistic philosophical stance. As molecular biology examined the details of living cells in light of DNA and its constituent molecules, it became clear that a mechanistic understanding based on physics and chemistry was not sufficient for explaining the apparent intentional organization observed in the molecular proofreading and editing of DNA replication phenomena, and many other routine processes maintaining the vitality of a cell. Even the sacred cow of Darwin's theory was brought under scrutiny and subjected to crushing critique by the scientific community itself, in addition to attacks from Christian and other religious groups. Today, Darwin's tree of life has been reduced to a tenuous bush or even a rhizomatic forest. The idea of natural selection was challenged and defeated by the neutral evolution theory of Kimura. Subatomic quantum mechanics based on probability theory presents the measurement problem by which the role of the observer becomes a necessity but remains a mystery. Srila Prabhupada conceived the Bhaktivedanta Institute as a scientific academy not only to challenge and defeat the hegemony that the modern materialistic science had on knowledge, but to present that Krishna consciousness was rational, scientific, and not merely based on pure religious sentiment. He also asked the scientists to demonstrate the scientific validity of Sripad Bhagavatam's conception of the cosmos. This, of course, is related to the problem of how matter comes from life. It is interesting that the Bhagavatam seems to present cosmogenesis partly from the dualistic Sankhya philosophical standpoint and partly from another viewpoint involving Brahma, which is a more unified version of a creator-created conception. There seems to be two pivotal points in the production of the material universe from the non-material. The first is the Yoga Nidra of Mahavishnu, and the second seems to be the Pradhan and Mahatattva, the latter in which the Jiva is also present, is involved. In the tradition of German idealism during the time of Schelling and Hegel, the idea that material nature is referred to as petrified intelligence or sleeping spirit was complementary to Aristotle's idea of the potentiality of thought and matter. So the Yoga Nidra or spirit or God that we find in the Bhagavatam was also present in the West. The idea of Pradhan is also found in the West as the potentiality of the actual world in Aristotle's matter, or even as ether. This idea has received importance in an unexpected form in the currently most advanced scientific field of quantum electrodynamics, or QED. The quantum vacuum is a non-observable field that contains the complete probability of the observable world. Particles are produced from this vacuum by creation and annihilation operators that excite or annul particles that appear in the observable world. In QED, the world does not exist independently of an observer or operator, and is all made of fields rather than particles. However, there is a problem in this theory for correctly accounting for gravity. Hegel locates the potentiality of the world in the finite singular soul, which he considers to be the immediate being of spirit. From the absolute idea or spirit manifests what he calls its externality or natural world, with which the soul can identify as much as with its other side or spiritual world. This is similar to the idea of the Tatastha Shakti between the Bahiranga external energy and the Antaranga Shakti spiritual energy. Subjective evolution from the soul's indifferent unconscious state to various stages of identification with nature in different degrees to lower forms of life to human anthropology is explained in a philosophical stepwise dialectical development. In this process, a differentiation of subject-object and consciousness arises along with the concept of I or finite rational ego. Going further, a distinction between the rational thinking of human beings disengages from a purely immediate identification with nature to a more mediated, self-determined state of freedom, its own rationally constituted self. This subjective process proceeds further into the objective sphere, where rational social institutions are formed that correspond to its inwardly developed subjective reason, basically constructing a second nature for itself on top of the first nature from which it began its journey. Further development of thought leads to philosophy, religion, and art, through which the absolute idea or truth is reached, in which spirit soul comprehends itself as spirit. This is not an objective evolution of bodies, but a subjective evolution of soul from an unconscious state of indifference, Tatastha Shakti, through its primitive identification with nature, and finally to its true identification as free spirit. The different attempts to comprehend the unities that appear in external nature as mechanical, solar system, chemical, biological, and teleological systems, and in natural and in internal or cultural nature as anthropological, social, political, moral, and ethical principles, religious and philosophical, as well as artistic endeavors, all arise from the soul's inherent tendency to establish its true spiritual nature and a world congruent with it. The proper conception of the body-soul relation is necessary for any scientific explanation of the relation of spirit to nature. But first, it is necessary to correct the unscientific misconceptions or presuppositions of the soul that most modern viewpoints embrace. In this process, it will also be important to understand the unique ontology of what it is to be a human being, and in what ways it is similar to other biological life forms, and in what ways it is different. Among the major erroneous presuppositions is that the soul is immaterial, foreign to the body, and which the human body is just like those of animals, which are composed of the same materials as stone or earth. These ideas do have some validity, which is why they have been accepted for so long. However, they fail to provide any explanatory basis for the human capacity for pure thought or will, pure meaning without admixture of sensuous reverence, or how a pure soul can interact with an extended body. The trajectory of a projected material body of metal can be predicted by mechanical laws of physics, but the trajectory of a flight of a living bird, for example, is not determinable in the same way by mechanical laws. This difference between living and non-living bodies is an observable phenomenon that requires scientific explanation beyond the mere laws of mechanics or chemistry. Biology as a distinct science is becoming recognized as the mere mechanistic and chemical theories are being shown to be inadequate for explaining complex biological phenomena. Whilst even animal behavior is not explained in purely biological terms, human behavior presents highly developed forms of life an animal possesses only in a most rudimentary way. These observable differences require scientific explanation that modern science does not seem to address at all. This, of course, is due to the fact that scientists cannot go beyond the purely material, mechanical, chemical, and biological conceptions of life. We can say that animals identify themselves with their world, whereas human beings try to comprehend themselves as spirit and express themselves in a world that reflects that. Thus, a systematic science of the soul is necessary to bring this subject into the form of scientific knowledge. An important note about the difference between consciousness and spirit or soul may be briefly addressed here. One cannot begin an explanation of things with the fact of consciousness as a given. Many scientists and even devotees consider consciousness as a given fact of what the Atma is, or even what Brahman is. This is doxa or dogma, much like what modern science proposes in dealing with things as immediately given to intuition, which is called naive realism, i.e. that which clearly exists. Vedanta explains the process for understanding anything properly requires knowing its origin, janmadasyata. This is a characteristic of archaic philosophy and is completely lost in modern science, along with the concept of final cause or purpose, or that for which things exist. Vedanta states that which is to be known is called Brahman, Brahmajigyasa. And the process of knowing Gya or meditation, Jigyasa, begins by determining its origin or birth, Janma. Because knowing requires consciousness, it is unlikely that we can consider Brahman to be consciousness, and knowing Brahman to be based upon what it already presupposes. The Sanskrit word Brahman does not really indicate consciousness, despite the fact that many, especially abstract monists, refer to it in that way. If we instead understand Brahman from the Sanskrit roots Br and Man as that foundation which expands or grows, they will lead to a conception which is based on a Bhaktivedanta Tattva, identity and difference. For growth means that something posits itself as different from itself and maintains its identity within itself. This is how Hegel defines spirit. Spirit posits itself as different from itself, basically a self-negation, yet reclaims this difference as identical with itself as its own determination of itself. In other words, it negates the negation, or is the absolute negation. The same process exists in thinking, which is the activity of opposing another thought that yet remains identical with the activity of thinking. A plant grows by duplicating itself at the mitochondrial level, mitosis. Yet the duplicate remains identical with the original plant throughout this differentiation and integration process. Matter, like crystals, grow by accumulation of matter outside itself, not by organic self-differentiation and integration. It is a mechanical process in which arbitrary changes or replacements of the contingently assembled parts does not change the overall whole. Thus, Brahman is better identified as spirit, as long as we can specify in some determinate way what we mean by spirit. Hegel provides a determinate way to do this, and thus it becomes a scientific term, and not merely some vague belief or faith. To understand consciousness requires knowledge of its fundamental nature and how it comes about. Because of its structure as a subject-object relation, it is basically dualistic, and this makes it problematic. Consciousness relates itself to its object, yet maintains its difference from the object with itself being subjective. The relation of the object to consciousness is called knowing, but this whole process remains vague and impossible for understanding to grasp in this form. Understanding consciousness as an act of relating and distinguishing itself rather than a fact, in which subject and object are constituent moments of that process, raises the problem to another level, which the foundation of consciousness is located in a dynamic organic system closer to the idea of spirit. It must also be emphasized that real difference is required in the negative activity of spirit, or else identity would not be meaningful. Singular and plural are both needed to signify either term. Advaita is not mere oneness, but the negation of duality, which itself is a negative relation. Thus, Advaita Gyan is understood as absolute negativity. Understanding the history of ideas helps to recognize how we arrived at the philosophical stance we accept today. The study and explanation of the subjective evolution of the soul or consciousness at the appropriate level of development and its objective manifestation is the current service with which the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute is primarily involved. The loving devotional development of the spirit soul is also studied in the light of the Sripad Bhagavatam, Brihad Bhagavatamita, and Ramananda Samvad. In his book, Subjective Evolution of Consciousness, Srila B.R. Sridhar Maharaj considered that Hegel's teaching provides a philosophical foundation for a Gaudiya Siddhanta, of course not including the conception of rasa. Hegel was a student of Plato and Aristotle, and the acceptance of that preceptorial line in Western philosophy is recognized by Srila Bhaktivedanta Thakur in the Bhagavad, its philosophy, its ethics, and its theology, where he writes, subjects of philosophy and theology are like the peaks of large, towering, and inaccessible mountains standing in the midst of our planet, inviting attention and investigation. Thinkers and men of deep speculation take their observations through the instruments of reason and consciousness. Plato looked at the peak of the spiritual question from the west, and Vyas made the observation from the east. The words and expressions are different, but the import is the same. They tried to find out the absolute religion, and their labors were crowned with success. But God gives all that he has to his children if they want to have it. It requires a candid, generous, pious, and holy heart to feel the beauties of their conclusions. By the grace of Sri Guru and Gauranga and Vaishnavas, we pray that they may be pleased with these humble attempts of service.